The Polynesian Triangle is like an ancient spearhead thrust across the great Pacific Ocean. Long ago, a voyaging people made this their home. The story of the Polynesians is an epic natural history. Man and nature, each shaping the destiny of the other. For 1,000 years, New Zealand had been the home of the Maori. Their Polynesian ancestors had come from faraway tropical islands and tamed this wild southern land. The splendid isolation of this proud people was soon to end. From beyond the distant horizon would come another people from an alien world. The impact of their encounter would echo across the entire Pacific Ocean. For generations, the Maori had battled against the hostile climate of this land and had fought over its natural wealth. After centuries of rivalry, they became the most fiercely tribal people in all of Polynesia. Long forgotten were the blue lagoons and swaying palms of their ancestral homeland in the South Seas. The native people of New Zealand called their land Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. It became the center of their physical and spiritual world. The first Maori explorers to discover the deep ocean inlet of Milford Sound on the rugged west coast of South Island came face to face with a landscape of overwhelming dimension. Surrounded by a natural cathedral of towering peaks carved by glaciers, this fjord is 10 miles long and the water 1,000 feet deep. It is one of the most inspiring features of New Zealand. Fiordland was and still is one of the most inaccessible parts of New Zealand. But in summer, the Maori came here in search of minerals and on hunting expeditions. For all Polynesians, the dolphin was a familiar but sacred creature. They were rarely killed. Some bottlenose dolphins are residents of these sheltered fjords. Others come in from the open ocean to feed and play. It was the free spirit of the dolphin, moving in close-knit family groups, that appealed to this seafaring people. Throughout the Pacific, dolphins were respected for their independence, cherished for the protection they gave to Polynesian voyagers. The temperate seas around New Zealand support a wealth of marine life. In the southern Pacific, the rich, cool waters of the Antarctic mingle with warm currents from the tropics, creating ideal conditions for all manner of fish. In New Zealand, the Maori discovered a bonanza of one highly prized catch: crayfish. From the depths of Milford Sound to the warmer waters off the east coast, the entire South Island seemed to be alive with these crustaceans, larger and more prolific than anywhere else in Polynesia. The Maori word kaikora means to eat crayfish, a name they gave to a large coastal region of South Island on account of its remarkable marine wealth. Colonies of fur seals, unknown in the tropics, flourished on the riches of these southern seas. Together with sea lions and elephant seals, these large sea creatures provided the Maori with a new supply of fatty meat. For many Maori, fur seals became a more important food than the creatures of the forest. But the Maori toll on marine mammals was nothing compared with the slaughter to come. The fur of these seals and the flesh of great whales would eventually draw an armada of ships from distant lands to plunder this southern ocean. By the 1880s, sealers and whalers had almost exterminated New Zealand's stock of marine mammals. This is Kaikora. Rich currents off the east coast attract great shoals of fish, pursued by schools of dusky dolphins, a species found only in the colder southern seas. To the Maori, New Zealand's natural wealth seemed limitless. the resources of the sea, and the great tracts of ancient forest were unparalleled on the other islands of Polynesia. Aotearoa appeared to be a land endowed by nature and truly blessed by their ancestral gods. The fresh water that flowed from its mountains not only replenished the life of the lowlands, but brought wealth of a different kind, which drew the Maori to the most remote valleys of the west coast. Where the rivers eroded the ancient bedrock, they discovered a new resource which dramatically changed their lives. Greenstone is New Zealand's famous jade. It is a hard rock which the Maori called pounamu. Known to geologists as nephrite, it was created under pressure in volcanic rocks rich in iron, and eventually emerged by erosion at the surface. The braided rivers of the east coast were a treasure trove of these precious stones. Some boulders were solid jade. Their innate strength and beauty was disguised, but split and laboriously ground to shape, each could be worked into a handsome tool. In its hardest form, it was tough enough to be fashioned into adzes for felling trees and carving canoes, and for making weapons of war. For a people who had yet to discover the might of metal, the sculptural strength of these stones was a powerful asset. It accelerated their domination of nature and their tribal conflict. Softer greenstone was translucent and was prized for its ornamental value. Maori craftsmen carved sacred tikis and ornaments, which were handed down the generations, acquiring the mana of their successive owners and imparting power to offspring of chiefly lines. The rocks, the water, the forest were all imbued with spirits. Like all Polynesians, the Maori needed the resources of the forest, but feared its spirits. Above all, they respected the mana of the majestic kauri tree. The oldest trees had stood here for 1,200 years, longer than the Maori had been part of this land. The largest rose 150 feet above the forest floor. These trees were the gods of the forest, from which they sought permission to exploit its wealth. Respect for nature was central to Maori culture, but paradoxically, each generation learned that they must take from the land. The Maori were the children of Tane, god of nature. They saw themselves as part of the forest. It was their link to the past, but they failed to conserve their future. By the time Europeans came to New Zealand, the Maori had destroyed half the native forest of Aotearoa. New Zealand was once a land of birds. With few natural predators, they had flourished in its forests. The Maori birdcatcher was a resourceful hunter. He pitted his cunning against his prey, devising traps that lured the forest birds to their death. The native forest parrot was given the Polynesian name of kaka. The Maori hunted it for flesh and feathers, often using a tame bird as a decoy, or by imitating its squeaky whistle. The hunter's snare was called the motokaka. It was simple, but effective. Maori hunters sealed the fate of New Zealand's flightless moa. All 11 species of this giant bird were hunted to extinction 2 centuries before the Europeans came. The Maori assumed that the resources of their forests were endless. As the Maori population grew, so did pressure on the island's natural resources. The maze of sheltered bays and inlets, now called the Marlborough Sounds, were patrolled by war canoes. Here, the land and sea provided great natural riches, and each tribe jealously guarded its territory. After centuries of exploiting the dwindling reserves of this land, the Maori now competed with each other to survive. For each tribe, their land, their whenua, was sacred, and each warrior would willingly die in its defense. At a time when their intertribal conflict had reached a bloody peak, the Maori confronted another enemy, one that pierced the sky. On December the 13th, 1642, the Dutch explorer, Abel Tasman, encountered Aotearoa, a land which in honor of his country was renamed Zealandia Nova. It was, he said, inhabited by fierce natives. None of Tasman's crew dared set foot on the new land. This first meeting between 2 very different worlds was just one of many tragic episodes in the modern history of the South Seas. A 127 years passed before the next encounter. This time, the ship was British, and its captain was called Cook. The Royal Society had commissioned his expedition to search for a southern land. On board were naturalists and artists, who in the spirit of the late 18th century were motivated by curiosity, not by colonial greed. Unlike Tasman, Cook described the Maori as a vigorous and nimble people who seemed generally mild and gentle, except to their enemies. He noted many similarities in custom and language between the Maori and the South Sea Islanders, and wondered how it was possible for one race of people to be spread so far across this ocean. Cook's first Pacific voyage had taken him from Tahiti to New Zealand at the end of 1769, where he spent 6 months mapping its coastline. It was an extraordinary accomplishment, but his voyage of exploration returned with much more than accurate maritime charts. The great cabin of HMS Endeavour was given over to the work of collating and preserving specimens of New Zealand's plants and insects, fish and birds. This was the first expedition to employ the skills of professional naturalists. Together with illustrators, they provided a detailed record of the flora and fauna of this foreign land. Their meticulous observation in the wild and careful sampling of each new species built up a vivid picture of New Zealand's natural history. The Maori were equally curious about these strangely clothed men who collected plants and animals, most of which they did not eat, but dried and pickled. While the naturalists on board Cook's ship closely studied the curiosities of New Zealand, they were themselves the objects of much wonder and amusement. The Endeavour party mirrored the society from which it came. It was a bizarre sideshow of Georgian England touring the far side of the world. For their part, the naturalists discovered that this country harbored much that was unique to science. Joseph Banks, the young and successful botanist, collected and described its plant and animal life. His entry for the 7th of March, 1770, refers to sea crawfish, or lobsters, that were traded with the Maori in great quantities. In the 18th century, the study of natural history was primarily concerned with naming and categorizing the world's fauna and flora. Being the first naturalists to visit the islands of Polynesia, they faced a challenging task of identification. Some of the plants and animals were recognizable from related species. Others were totally new to them. All that they and the professional artists observed and recorded on that voyage became the basis of our present knowledge about an ocean that covers almost 1/3 of the globe. The Pohutakawa, New Zealand's Christmas flower, blossoms in December, New Zealand's midsummer. In Cook's time, there were still tracts of forest filled with birds. The tui was renowned for its repertoire of song, as was the kokako. The naturalists on board the Endeavour remarked particularly on the rich bird life. The call of the bellbird is still a feature of New Zealand, but less adaptable birds, like the kokako, have almost disappeared. Wholesale transformation of the landscape, started by the Maori, would be continued by the new settlers who came in the wake of Captain Cook. During his 3 Pacific voyages, Cook developed a great affection for New Zealand and its people. He recorded his concern about the impact of European encounter. Once penetrated, this isolated world would never be the same again. On each visit, he improved his charts of New Zealand. They became invaluable to the traders and whalers and the European settlers who in the next decades followed the trail to the South Seas. But Cook's motives were quite different. Today he is celebrated not just for his discoveries, but for his methods of scientific exploration. He became a model by which his successes in the Pacific would be judged. Admired by his crew, he took them safely into uncharted waters in search of new lands and unknown people. There was one other place to which he repeatedly returned. To the northeast of New Zealand, 2,500 miles across the Pacific, lay a tropical island for which he and his men had great affection. None of them doubted that here, in the center of this newly explored ocean, they had found paradise. The impact of Tahiti on Europe was as sensational as the impact of Europe on Tahiti. Living on this South Sea island was a noble and beautiful people who were entirely innocent of the world outside their Garden of Eden. The first visitors from Europe were seduced by the idyllic life on Tahiti. What they did not know was that the apparent well-being of the Tahitian people had been achieved by centuries of hard toil, an often savage conflict with nature and each other. Many sacrifices had been made. Paradise had been hard won. Ground sandalwood, mixed with the monoi oil of the coconut, made a sweet-smelling lotion to protect the skin from the blistering sun and to deter the biting flies that plague most tropical islands. For all Tahitians, cleanliness is paramount. Beauty is not simply for the eye, it embraces all the senses. 2 centuries ago, the Tahitian way of life fired the imagination of all Europe. The noble savage was indeed alive and well. Throughout the Pacific, from New Zealand to Hawaii, new ideas and new values rapidly reshaped people's lives. A bunch of ship's nails would buy a share in paradise. In exchange for a musket and gunpowder, an entire vessel could be provisioned. By the mid-19th century, the Hawaiian Islands were visited by 600 ships a year. With them, they brought diseases unknown to the Pacific, some carried by insects, most by the men themselves. The Polynesians, who for 2,000 years had lived in isolation, were left with much more than they had bargained for. The fatal foreign impact soon echoed across all the islands of Polynesia. From Hawaii to New Zealand, the islanders succumbed to diseases imported by the Europeans. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and venereal disease ran riot. Isolated for centuries from the outside world, they had no immunity to common ailments such as measles and whooping cough. By the middle of the 19th century, on many islands, including New Zealand, half the population died. In the wake of traders who ravaged the islanders' resources, came missionaries to save their souls. Ancestral Polynesian gods were banished. In place of ancient taboos, a new religion preached about sin and eternal damnation. To the foreigners, the Polynesian people gave their souls and the lifeblood of their land. Sandalwood, prized by people from the Orient, was hewn from the native forest of Hawaii and the Marquesas, until within 20 years, almost every tree was gone. Polynesians, beguiled by the novelty of the outside world, sacrificed their natural heritage. With the Europeans came their favored livestock. Horses harnessed power and mobility unknown to the islanders. Cattle, goats, and sheep provided food. But all these animals, alien to the land, browsed and grazed the fragile native vegetation to the ground. Today, New Zealand without sheep would be a very different place. They were taken there by British settlers who in the early 19th century sought to turn the country into a pastoral land of plenty. By 1870, a century after Cook first set foot there, the European population of 250,000 outnumbered the Maori by 5 to 1, and there were 9 million sheep. Today, 60 million graze the grasslands of New Zealand, where once stood ancient forest. In Hawaii, they grew new crops. Where the first Hawaiians had cultivated terraces of taro, the newcomers introduced sugar and plantations of pineapples, a cash crop imported from Brazil and picked by workers from the Philippines. Honolulu was a Polynesian village. Its name means sheltered bay. Today, it is the capital city of the 50th state of America. Imported minor birds thrive in this new landscape, ousting the less adaptable native species, just as they've done throughout the Pacific. Where unique Hawaiian honey creepers once probed for nectar of native Hawaiian flowers, foreign pigeons scavenge for urban scraps and pick over the strip of beach called Waikiki. Waikiki is Hawaiian for spouting water. Now it is a watering hole for an international set. Less than 1% of the population of Hawaii is pure Hawaiian. Hawaii is now a menagerie of strangers. Each year, it receives millions of foreign visitors. An innocent suitcase may contain an ecological time bomb, a plant or insect pest that could decimate the already depleted native wildlife of these once isolated islands. Only vigilance will keep the aliens out.
Well, would you please observe here, that you're supposed to declare all fruits, all meats.
Are you carrying any fresh fruits, citrus, herbs or spices, or live plants or animal products inside your backpack?
No, sir.
You have nothing at all inside your backpack?
No.
Jets are today's voyaging craft. As each plane pierces the sky and touches down, it brings stowaways from the outside world, in its hold, on its passengers, trapped in its undercarriage. On Guam in the Western Pacific, the brown tree snake, accidentally brought in on a cargo ship, virtually wiped out the native birds. In aircraft landing gear, a few have reached Hawaii. If these snakes had survived, they would be the single most lethal threat to the island's fragile bird life. There are more endangered species in Hawaii than all the mainland of the United States. For many, these craters are their last refuge, the only parts of the islands not used by people. Out of reach of the modern world, silver swords and other unique plants still manage to survive. Hawaii has been besieged by thousands of foreign species, 2,000 different insects and spiders, 50 alien birds, and 18 mammals overwhelm the native wildlife. One bird, the Hawaiian goose, has made a comeback. The nene almost became extinct. A breeding program, pioneered by the Wildfowl Trust in Slimbridge, England, saved the species in captivity, but in the wild, it is still threatened. It has not yet developed the instinct to protect itself, its eggs, and its goslings from the new predators that plague even these remote parts of Hawaii. In 1883, the mongoose was intentionally introduced to Hawaii to control rats on the island's valuable new plantations. Instead, it has learned to steal the eggs of the nene. Desperate steps are now being taken to eradicate this unwanted pest, but the mongoose, as on all islands to which it has been introduced, is still winning. To date, more than 2,000 birds have been released into the wild, but only 500 have survived. Around Hawaii's crater refuges, conservationists have built a 34-mile fence, a last stand against extinction of the nene, one of the few surviving members of Hawaii's unique natural heritage. On North Island, New Zealand, is Tongariro, a sacred mountain of the Maori. On its slopes they buried their ancestors. Fearing exploitation by the newcomers, the chief gave this sacred tribal land to the new nation on condition that they should be respected and preserved. In 1887, Tongariro became the first national park in Polynesia. Since then, native New Zealanders have found renewed interest in their native wildlife. In the rich seas off Kaikoura, where foreign vessels once plundered giant whales, there is now a different kind of exploitation.
Sperm whale, this is what he looks like. Can everybody see? What this whale's doing on the surface is reoxygenating.
At a place where harpooning ended only 2 decades ago, these sperm whales have become the focus of a booming tourist industry. At Kaikoura, the continental shelf is only 2 miles offshore. Here, in the depths, live giant squid, the favorite prey of sperm whales.
Whales come up, they spend 5 to 10 minutes on the surface storing oxygen. Then when they dive, Their heart rate slows right down. The blood's only directed to vital organs.
The whale-watching enterprise was launched by the local Maori community to combat unemployment and has become big business. A new lease of life for them and for the whales.
Okay, yep, here he goes. Okay, get ready, folks. Think magic, because it's tail time just about now. Whoa, look at that one. That's a big one. Woo!
In the 2,000 years since the Polynesians found the remote islands of the Pacific, nature has been transformed to suit their human needs. On remote Easter Island, their passion for erecting stone statues to honor their gods led to their downfall. Stripped of its trees to transport the giant moai and to provide fuel for fires, the island became barren and the culture died. Easter Island is a graphic reminder that living on islands is a fragile existence, for wildlife and for people. The islands of New Zealand are the largest and by far the most ancient in Polynesia. But even here, in little more than 1,000 years, 3/4 of their native forest has been destroyed. Today, the surviving remnants are treasured by Maori and by other New Zealanders, for whom the great kauri trees are icons of their country. For Maori children, the benevolent spirit of Tane still lives alongside the new faith that came with iron and sheep. Throughout New Zealand, ancient taboos are being strengthened by modern views of conservation. For the Maori, the great sweep of 90-mile beach is the highway to their spiritual home. This straggling northernmost tip of New Zealand is a link with their Polynesian past. It is along this line of sand dunes that the spirits of the dead return to their ancestral homeland. At the end of summer, migrating godwits set course for warmer northern lands. For New Zealand Maori, these birds, the kuaka, are kindred spirits heading back to the sacred island of Raiatea, that faraway heaven in the very heart of tropical Polynesia. For many years, the world could not believe that the Maori and the islanders of the South Seas were the same race. It seemed impossible that a Stone Age culture could have conquered the Pacific. Now, they voyage again to renew the ancient links that tie them as one people. In replica canoes, they once more brave the ocean with relearned skills to prove that their ancestors had sailed purposefully to settle these remote islands. From as far away as Hawaii, Polynesians recently came together in the Cook Islands to hold the Festival of Pacific Arts. For 2 centuries, the Pacific had not seen such a flotilla of traditionally built sailing craft, nor such a wealth of rediscovered skills. Those that could not voyage in traditional style came by modern boats and planes, from Tahiti and the Marquesas, from Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, New Zealand, and even Easter Island. For 2 weeks, Rarotonga, the main island of the Cooks, became the focal point of the entire Polynesian world. This was not an event staged for the outside world. It was very much a South Seas affair, in honor of each other. The people who came to Rarotonga witnessed a new chapter in the story of the Pacific, another step forward in the revival of Polynesian culture. Polynesian people are asserting their concern for the future of their islands, both ecologically and politically. At the 11th hour, one of the most widespread people on Earth have rediscovered their long and common heritage. But there is a realization that much has been lost along the way. Human customs and skills can be revitalized, but the nature of the islands may be beyond repair. For 2,000 years, the fortunes of all the native wildlife of these remote oceanic islands have been shaped and reshaped, first by the Polynesians and then by the newcomers. In the center of the Pacific, the first Polynesian people harnessed the nature of the land and the sea to create their paradise. The lives of the native people and the native wildlife of the South Seas were fashioned by their long isolation. In this new age of the Pacific, their destinies are dependent on each other. Polynesia is now part of a much wider world, which is still in search of paradise.